To Nazi Germany, they were Untermensch subhuman, beings officially classified by racial doctrine as incapable of mastering complex machinery or demonstrating courage in combat. So why, in the skies over Europe, did the ace pilots of the Luftwaffe begin to whisper a name with a mixture of fear and awe? Schwarze Vogelmänner, the Black Birdmen. This isn't just a story of dogfights. This is the story of a greater war. A war against hatred, fought at 30,000 feet, where courage has no color, and it began with an experiment that America itself had set up to fail. The fight for the soul of the world was raging, but for a group of young men in America, the war was being fought on two fronts. The first was against the Axis powers overseas. The second, a more intimate and bitter struggle, was against the country they called home. To understand the fire that forged the Tuskegee Airmen, you must first understand the chilling reality of the cage they were forced to break out of. In 1925, a report from the U.S. Army War College, titled The Employment of Negro Manpower in War, laid the prejudice bare in cold, official ink. It concluded, "Compared to the white man, he is admittedly of inferior mentality. He is inherently weak in character." This wasn't just an opinion, it was official military doctrine. A psychological prison built from pseudo-science and bigotry, designed to keep an entire race of men grounded. It was a declaration that the color of a man's skin determined his capacity for valor. Yet, long before the Tuskegee experiment was even conceived, the seeds of defiance were already taking flight. They were sown by forgotten pioneers, men like Eugene Bullard, the son of a former slave, who became the first African-American military pilot. He flew not for America, which rejected him, but for France during World War I, earning the nickname the Black Swallow of Death. They were sown by women like Bessie Coleman, who, denied entry to every American flight school, traveled to France in 1921 to earn her pilot's license, returning to America as a barnstorming sensation, a living testament to the lie of inferiority. These weren't just anomalies, they were prophecies of what was possible. As the 1,930 seconds gave way to the ominous storm clouds of another world war, the pressure cooker of American society began to hiss. Civil rights leaders, the tireless Walter White of the NAACP, the formidable labor leader A. Philip Randolph, lobbied the Roosevelt administration relentlessly. They weren't just asking for inclusion, they were demanding that America live up to its own creed. The black press became a battleground of its own. Newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier championed the Double V campaign, victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. They hammered the White House with a simple, devastating question. How could a nation fight for democracy in Europe while strangling it in its own backyard? Politics, as it often does, moved not with the speed of morality, but with the slow grind of necessity. In 1939, Public Law 18 finally cracked the door open, a grudging concession that required the government to fund flight training for black pilots, albeit at segregated schools. Then, as Franklin D. Roosevelt campaigned for an unprecedented third term in 1940, he needed the black vote in crucial northern states. The relentless pressure had found its political moment. On January 16, 1941, the War Department made a stunning announcement: the formation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, an all-black flying unit, but the announcement came with a chilling caveat, a whisper that revealed the military's true expectations. This would be an experiment, a test, a trial to see if black men could be trained as combat pilots. They weren't creating a fighting force, they were testing a hypothesis, and the entire military establishment was waiting for the data to confirm their prejudice. Into this crucible stepped a man forged in silence. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. understood the weight of this experiment better than anyone. He was the son of America's first black general, a man who carried the burden of his father's legacy and the hopes of his entire race. His preparation for command wasn't just in flight school. It was in the cold, isolating halls of West Point. For 4 years, he was a ghost in the machine. No white cadet would speak his name outside of an official order. He ate alone in a mess hall crowded with 1,000 men. He lived in a silence designed to shatter a man's spirit, to force him to quit. But the silence didn't break him. It forged him. It stripped away every weakness, leaving only a core of unbreakable discipline and an unshakable resolve. He learned that to lead, he would have to be better, smarter, and more disciplined than anyone around him. He learned that failure was not an option, because his failure would be used as an indictment against 13 million people. Now, he was being asked to lead 26 young pilots, the first graduates of the Tuskegee experiment. These men had trained harder and longer than their white counterparts. The washout rate at Tuskegee was a brutal 60%, compared to 40% for white cadets. Only the absolute best survived. They were, as their white commander at Tuskegee, Colonel Noel Parrish, called them, a super-selected group. They were ready to fight. They were ready to die for their country. But as Captain Davis prepared to lead his men into the cauldron of North Africa in April 1943, he knew they faced more than just the German Luftwaffe. They faced the deep-seated skepticism of their own commanders, the quiet condescension of their allies, and the crushing weight of a nation's prejudice. The world was watching, and many, both friend and foe, were waiting for them to fall. The experiment was about to begin, and the first test would be a trial by fire. The sun-baked earth of Farjuna, Tunisia, offered no warm welcome. When the 99th Fighter Squadron arrived in April 1943, they were attached to the 33rd Fighter Group, a unit commanded by Colonel William W. Mockery. Mockery was a man who saw the world in black and white, and in his eyes, the pilots of the 99th were a problem to be managed, not warriors to be unleashed. He made his skepticism no secret. It hung in the hot desert air, thicker than the dust. This was the first taste of their second war. They hadn't even seen an enemy plane, and already they were in a fight for respect, a fight for a chance. They inherited the P-40 Warhawks, the hand-me-downs of the Air Force. These were tired, patched-up birds already considered obsolete, outclassed in speed and climb rate by the Luftwaffe's sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and formidable Focke-Wulf 190 seconds. It was a symbolic gesture that screamed their status, "You are second-rate." Mockery's strategy for the 99th was one of containment. He assigned them to the periphery of the war. Routine coastal patrols, monotonous reconnaissance, the inglorious milk runs. A quiet rage simmered within the squadron. These men, the best of the best from Tuskegee, had crossed an ocean to fight for their country, only to be tasked with scanning empty patches of the Mediterranean Sea. They were knights being told to polish the castle's silverware while a battle raged beyond the walls. Captain Davis, ever the stoic, preached discipline and patience, but even he could feel the gnawing frustration. They were in a combat zone, yet their greatest enemy was the prejudice of their own command. Then came July 2nd, 1943. A day that began like any other, with the familiar drone of engines and the shimmering heat of the Sicilian coast. Charles B. Hall, a 22-year-old first lieutenant from Brazil, Indiana, was flying his 8th mission. The objective: escorting B-25 Mitchell bombers on a raid against the Castelvetrano airfield in Sicily. It was another high-stakes mission where they were expected to be the dutiful, unseen shield. As the bombers released their payload and turned for home, the sky erupted. Two Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds, the butcher birds of the Luftwaffe, screamed down on the formation, their cannons winking with malice. This was the moment, the culmination of years of training, of enduring insults, of flying endless, empty circles over the sea. For Hall, the world narrowed to the glass of his gun sight. He later described the moment with the cool clarity of a professional. "I saw two Focke-Wulfs following the bombers just after the bombs were dropped. I headed for the space between the fighters and the bombers and managed to turn inside the Jerrys." In the deadly ballet of aerial combat, getting inside an enemy's turn is everything. Hall was no longer a test subject. He was a predator. His P-40 shuddered as the 6.50 caliber machine guns roared to life, spitting a stream of fire and steel. "I fired a long burst and saw my tracers penetrate the second aircraft," he recalled. The German pilot, a member of the so-called master race, was caught completely by surprise. His Focke-Wulf, a machine built on an ideology of superiority, faltered. It turned left. Then, as if its very will to fly had been broken, it suddenly fell off and headed straight into the ground. A plume of black smoke rising from the Sicilian countryside was the exclamation point. A black pilot had shot down one of Germany's elite fighters. The impossible had just happened. When Hall landed his Warhawk back at base, the news had already spread like wildfire. The entire airfield erupted. It was a raw, cathartic explosion of joy. The black ground crews, the mechanics, the armourers, the men who had endured months of casual slights and outright insults from white personnel finally had their answer. They swarmed Hall's plane, hoisting him onto their shoulders. This wasn't just Hall's victory. It was theirs. It was a kill for every man who had ever been called inferior, for every doubt they had ever faced. It was a single, deafening shot, fired back at a prejudiced world. That afternoon, a small swastika was painted on the side of Hall's P-40, the first mark of a legacy that would be written in blood and fire across the skies of Europe. One would think this singular act of proven valour would silence the critics. One would be wrong. For Colonel Momia, Hall's victory was an inconvenient data point that contradicted his foregone conclusion. He saw what he wanted to see. And so, even as the men of the 99th were finally proving their worth in the crucible of combat, Momia sharpened his pen and authored a lie. Several months later, he filed a devastating report to his superiors. It was a dagger wrapped in official language. He claimed the pilots of the 99th lacked aggressiveness and were poor combat flyers. He twisted their disciplined protection of bombers into a lack of fighting spirit. And then came the final, brutal recommendation. He requested that the entire 99th Fighter Squadron be removed from combat operations. The report landed on the desk of General Henry Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The experiment was failing. The data, at least the data that was being officially reported, confirmed the Army's initial prejudice. Arnold prepared the order to shut it all down, to relegate the Tuskegee Airmen to the footnotes of history as a failed experiment. After their greatest triumph, the men of the 99th were closer than ever to being permanently grounded, not by the Luftwaffe, but by the very army they served. The death warrant for the Tuskegee experiment sat on a desk in Washington, D.C. It was nothing more than a piece of paper, a report penned by Colonel Momia. But it carried the weight of a guillotine. General Hap Arnold, a man who trusted the chain of command, had his pen ready. With a whisper of ink, the story of the 99th Fighter Squadron could have ended right there, a footnote of failure, a confirmation of prejudice. But history is not always written by men in quiet offices. Sometimes it is forged in the desperate hell of a battlefield. Hundreds of miles away, on the coast of Italy, Allied forces were trapped in a bloody stalemate. The landings at Anzio in January 1944 were meant to be a swift, decisive strike to break the German lines and open the road to Rome. Instead, they had become a nightmare. The beachhead was a cage of death, with Allied soldiers pinned down by relentless German artillery and air attacks. Above them, the Luftwaffe prowled the skies with impunity, raining down steel and fire on the trapped men below. The situation was critical. The entire Anzio campaign was on the verge of collapsing. In the calculus of desperation, old prejudices become a luxury one can no longer afford. The 99th Fighter Squadron, the unit that was about to be disbanded for being unaggressive, was suddenly thrown into the heart of the inferno. It wasn't a vote of confidence. It was a last resort. When you're out of options, you use the tools you were about to throw away. January 27th, 1944. 15 pilots of the 99th climbed into their worn P-40 Warhawks and flew towards the maelstrom. On the ground, battle-hardened Allied troops looked up and saw the unfamiliar squadron arriving, likely with a sense of pity. They knew what was waiting for them. The elite, battle-tested pilots of the Luftwaffe in their superior Focke-Wulf 190 seconds. It was a mismatch on paper, a slaughter in the making, but the pilots of the 99th were not flying with manuals and statistics. They were flying with the fury of men who had everything to prove and nothing left to lose. This wasn't just another mission. This was for their careers. This was for their honor. This was for every black child who would ever dare to look at the sky and dream. The sky over Anzio erupted into a vortex of twisting metal and cannon fire. German pilots, accustomed to swatting away Allied fighters, dove in for the kill, expecting an easy victory. What they found was a buzzsaw. The Tuskegee pilots met them head-on. They used the P-40's only real advantage, its tight turning radius with vicious precision, getting inside the Germans' attacks and turning the hunter into the hunted. They fought with a disciplined ferocity that defied every line in Mommier's report. They weren't just protecting the beachhead. They were cleansing the sky. The radio chatter back at Allied command crackled with disbelief. Reports of enemy aircraft being shot down began to pour in. One after another, then another. The numbers were unbelievable. Over 2 days of savage combat, the 15 pilots of the 99th, in their obsolete fighters, shot down a confirmed 12 German aircraft. Captain Charles Hall, the man who had scored their first ever kill, added 2 more Fokker-Wulfs to his tally, silencing any notion that his first victory had been a fluke. They were not just surviving, they were dominating. They had looked into the face of the Luftwaffe's best and had not flinched. They had become the masters of the sky over Anzio. The news of their stunning success rocketed up the chain of command, landing with the force of a bomb on the same desks where their disbandment was being planned. The initial reaction was confusion, then outright disbelief. How could a squadron deemed unfit for combat suddenly achieve one of the most lopsided victories of the Italian campaign? The numbers didn't add up. The report from the front directly contradicted the report from Colonel Mommier. General Arnold was now faced with a paradox. He could either trust the prejudiced assessment of a single commander, or he could trust the undeniable results written in the wreckage of 12 German warplanes. The stakes were too high for guesswork. He ordered an immediate, high-level investigation. The War Department launched a formal study, a cold, impartial analysis of the numbers. They compared the combat records of the 99th Fighter Squadron against every other P-40 squadron in the entire theatre of operations. They analyzed kills, losses, mission effectiveness, and every other possible metric. The military establishment held its breath, waiting for the data to settle the matter once and for all. The results of the study were unequivocal. They were a bombshell that shattered a century of military prejudice. The 99th Fighter Squadron was performing just as well, and in some key areas, better than their white counterparts flying the exact same aircraft. Mommier's report was exposed for what it was, not a military assessment, but a tapestry of lies woven from the bitter ink of prejudice. The experiment was not a failure. It was a resounding, undeniable success. In Washington, the order to disband the 99th was torn up. The pen that was meant to end their story was instead used to authorize their future. They had been tried by fire and judged by prejudice, and in the heat of battle, they had burned the prejudice to ashes. The door to their future hadn't just been kept open, it had been kicked off its hinges. The path to legend was now clear. The victory at Anzio was more than a military triumph. It was a vindication. The chains of prejudice had been shattered in the skies over Italy. Now, it was time to unleash the storm. In May of 1944, the scattered black squadrons, the 99th, the 100th, the 301st, and 302nd, were forged into a single, formidable weapon, the 332nd Fighter Group, and with this new beginning came a new machine. They were finally given the thoroughbred they deserved, the North American P-51 Mustang. This was the finest piston-engine fighter of the entire war, an instrument of aerial perfection. With its powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could outrun and outclimb nearly anything the Luftwaffe could put in the sky. Most importantly, with its incredible range, it could follow American bombers all the way to the heart of the German Reich and back. They were no longer the underdogs with hand-me-down equipment. They were equals, and they were about to be given an identity that would become legendary. As part of a new Army Air Forces directive to make fighter groups instantly identifiable in the chaos of battle, the 332nd was assigned a color: red. They didn't just paint the noses or the wingtips, they drenched their tails in crimson. The P-51 seconds, already a graceful and deadly aircraft, now became unmistakable. They were the Red Tails. Gathering his pilots at their new base at Ramitelli, Italy, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. laid down the directive that would define their legacy. He looked at his men, now equipped with the best fighters in the world, and he gave them an order that ran counter to the very instinct of a fighter pilot. It was a choice that would place honor above glory. "We cannot afford to lose bombers," he told them, his voice resonating with the quiet authority forged in the silence of West Point. "Our job is not to be aces. Our job is to bring those bombers home." This was a profound, almost radical philosophy. In an air war where individual glory was measured in kills, where pilots became celebrated aces by peeling off to hunt down enemy fighters, Davis was ordering his men to resist that temptation. He was asking them to embrace a higher calling, to be guardians, to be shepherds. It was a sacred trust, and it would become their creed. To understand why this creed made them angels, you have to fly for a moment in the belly of the beast. A B-17 flying fortress, 6 miles above the earth. Inside, it's 50 degrees below zero, the air is thin. The unpressurized cabin is a vibrating, deafening tube of aluminum. 10 young men, with an average age of 21, are huddled inside, their lives depending on a thin metal skin. Outside, the sky is filled with black puffs of death, exploding flak shells that can tear a wing off in a heartbeat. And then, out of the blinding sun, they come. The German fighters, diving with cannons blazing, turning the lumbering bomber formation into a shooting gallery. For a bomber crew, this was a special kind of hell. They were a giant, slow-moving target, and their only hope was their escort, their little friends. But too often, those little friends would get drawn into dogfights, chasing German fighters for a kill, leaving the bombers exposed. The sky was vast and chaotic. A moment of distraction was a death sentence. Then, the bomber crews started seeing something different. A new group of Mustangs, with tails painted a brilliant, bloody red. And these fighters, they didn't behave like the others. They stuck close, incredibly close. They would weave a protective shield above and beside the bomber boxes, a constant, reassuring presence. When a bomber was hit and began to fall out of formation, a wounded straggler that was usually easy prey, the Red Tails wouldn't abandon it. They would escort the crippled bird, fighting off attackers, staying with it as long as they possibly could. Word spread like gospel through the bomber groups of the 15th Air Force. Whispers in the debriefing tents, talk over coffee in the mess halls. "Did you see those guys today? The ones with the red tails?" They never leave you. They didn't know the race of the men flying those planes. They didn't care. They only knew that when the red-tailed Mustangs appeared, their chances of seeing another sunrise increased exponentially. They gave them a name, a title born of gratitude and awe, the Red-Tail Angels. And from that name, a legend grew. A powerful myth that echoed for decades after the war. The legend that the Red Tails of the 332nd Fighter Group never lost a single bomber they escorted. And that legend is not entirely true. The historical record shows they did lose bombers, 27 of them, to be exact, over the course of 179 escort missions. But here is the truth that is far more powerful than the myth. A comprehensive Air Force study after the war compared the 332nd to every other P-51 fighter group in the 15th Air Force. The average number of bombers lost by those other groups was 46. Let that sink in. They weren't perfect. They were better. Nearly 40% better. By sticking to Colonel Davis's sacred trust, by choosing to be guardians instead of glory hounds, they had compiled the most effective bomber protection record of any fighter group in the theater. Their legacy wasn't built on mythology. It was built on a foundation of discipline, courage, and a promise kept. The bomber crews didn't need a perfect record to call them angels. They just needed them to be there. And the Red Tails were always there. By March of 1945, the war in Europe was in its death throes. The once mighty Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Its propeller planes swept from the skies by the sheer numerical and industrial might of the Allies. But the Third Reich had one last terrifying card to play. It was a weapon born of desperation and genius, a futuristic spectre that looked like it had flown out of a different decade. The Messerschmitt Me 262. This was the world's first operational jet fighter. A machine with swept-back wings and no propeller, it sliced through the air with a sinister hiss, its arrowhead silhouette a vision of a new age of warfare. With a top speed of over 540 miles per hour, it was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang. It could appear, strike, and vanish before a propeller pilot even had time to react. For Allied bomber crews, it was a ghost. For the fighter pilots meant to protect them, it was a nightmare. On March 24, 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group was given its most daunting assignment yet. The mission: escort B-17 bombers on a grueling 1,600-mile round trip deep into enemy territory to attack the Daimler-Benz tank factory in Berlin, the dying heart of the Nazi Empire. Intelligence was grim. The target would be defended by an elite squadron of Me-262. Colonel Davis led 43 red-tail Mustangs into the hostile skies. As they neared Berlin, the future appeared. A swarm of Me-262, the largest jet fighter force ever assembled for a single interception, rose to meet them. But the Red Tails had not just been training, they had been studying. They knew they couldn't fight the jet on its own terms. To chase it was suicide. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown, one of the pilots that day, had analyzed the jet's weaknesses. It was fast, but it couldn't turn as sharply as a Mustang, and its acceleration at lower speeds was poor. "We knew the German jets were faster than we were," he explained. "Instead of going directly after them, we went away from them and then turned into their blind spots. It was a brilliant strategy of aerial judo. Use the enemy's own speed and momentum against him." As one of the jets flashed past him, Roscoe Brown executed his plan perfectly. He didn't chase. He turned, pulled up into a steep climb, and fired 3 long bursts into the jet's vulnerable underbelly. The Me-262, a marvel of German engineering, shuddered violently as its pilot bailed out into the cold German air. That same day, Lieutenant Earl Lane did what was considered impossible, hitting an Me-262 from an extreme deflection angle, and Lieutenant Charles Brantley claimed the third jet victory. 3 jets, 3 kills. In a single afternoon, the Red Tails had destroyed more of Hitler's superweapons than most fighter groups would down in the entire war. They had met the future of aerial combat and proven it was not invincible. For this incredible achievement, the 332nd Fighter Group was awarded the Distinguished Unit Citation, one of the nation's highest military honors. But not every battle ended in victory, and not every pilot returned to a hero's welcome. For 32 of the Tuskegee Airmen, the war ended in a parachute descent into enemy territory. Their stories reveal a strange and bitter paradox at the heart of their struggle. On August 12, 1944 months before the legendary Berlin mission, Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson was on his 19th mission, strafing German radar installations in southern France. His P-51 was ripped apart by flak, forcing him to bail out. He was captured almost immediately. At the interrogation center, a crisp, well-spoken Luftwaffe officer sat across from him. Jefferson steeled himself for the worst. But the officer didn't resort to brutality. He resorted to intelligence. Chillingly thorough intelligence. He had information about Ramitelli Airfield, about our squadron commanders. Even details about my parents' home in Detroit, Jefferson recalled, his voice still filled with disbelief decades later. He knew my father was a teacher and my mother's maiden name. The Germans knew exactly who the Red Tails were. They took them seriously, not as an experiment, but as a lethal and respected foe. Jefferson was sent to Stalag Luft III, the same POW camp made famous by the Great Escape. And it was there, surrounded by the barbed wire of his Nazi captors, that he experienced a profound and deeply unsettling irony. For the first time in his life, he was treated as an equal by his white countrymen. The white American bomber pilots he had been protecting men he would never have been allowed to share a barracks or a mess hall with, back in segregated America, now saw him as just another American officer. They would approach him in the prison yard, shake his hand, and thank him. "We were always glad to see you guys," they'd say. "We knew we were safe when the red tails were on our wing." In the shared misery of a Nazi prison camp, the color lines of home simply melted away. They were all Americans. They were all prisoners. They were all brothers in arms. The irony was not lost on Jefferson. It was a truth so sharp it cut to the bone. "Here I was," he would later write, "in a Nazi POW camp, being treated more equally by white Americans than I would be back home." He had to become a prisoner of war to experience a taste of the freedom he was fighting for. This respect was not just confined to the prison yard. It had a name in the sky. While American newspapers were still minimizing their successes, the Luftwaffe pilots they fought against had given them their own title, a name born out of hard-fought experience: Schwarze Vogelmänner, the Black Birdmen. It wasn't a name given in mockery. It was a name given in respect for a deadly and disciplined enemy. The highest honor a warrior can receive is a name of respect given by his adversary. And for the Tuskegee Airmen, that honor came not from their allies, but from the very men they were tasked to destroy. The war ended. The guns fell silent. The skies over Europe grew quiet for the first time in 6 long years. But the math remained. The numbers, written in the smoke of downed enemy fighters and the safety of returning American bombers, were irrefutable. They formed an unimpeachable final argument against the lie that had grounded them for so long. Let's look at the final tally. The evidence that could not be ignored. Over 15,000 individual sorties flown across 1,578 combat missions, 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, 150 more destroyed on the ground, 950 rail cars, trucks, and other motor vehicles obliterated. And in a single legendary afternoon, 3 Me-262 jet fighters shot out of the sky. The men who flew these missions earned over 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 744 Air Medals, 14 Bronze Stars, and 8 Purple Hearts. Their units received 3 Distinguished Unit Citations. And what about that 1,925 Army War College report, the one that called them of inferior mentality and inherently weak in character? The Tuskegee Airmen had answered that report. They answered it with a bomber escort loss rate nearly 40% lower than the average of their peers. They answered it with the respect of their enemies and the gratitude of the men they protected. They had not just passed the experiment, they had smashed the laboratory to pieces. But victory in Europe did not guarantee a hero's welcome at home. For the Tuskegee Airmen, the end of one war simply marked the beginning of another. A third war fought not with machine guns, but against the quiet, grinding injustice of a nation that still refused to see them as equals. The bitter paradox that Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson had discovered in a Nazi POW camp became his immediate reality upon returning to American soil. After surviving capture, interrogation, and imprisonment, he disembarked from the ship that brought him home, a free man in the land of the free, and he was immediately directed to a line for colored personnel. The equality he had been granted by his fellow white prisoners in the heart of the Third Reich was instantly revoked the moment he stepped back into the democracy he had fought to defend. It was a welcome home that felt like a slap in the face. His story was not unique. Many of the airmen returned to a country that was more interested in preserving segregation than in celebrating their heroism. Their victories, which had been front-page news in black newspapers, were often ignored or minimized by the mainstream press. The story of their success didn't fit the preferred narrative. Lee Archer, an ace with 4 confirmed victories, returned home and eventually became a successful corporate executive. But for years, he rarely spoke of his time as a red-tail angel. "Nobody believed me anyway," he once said, the pain still evident in his voice. "A black fighter pilot? Must be lying." The war against being forgotten had begun, but they refused to be erased. The double V campaign, victory abroad and victory at home, had not ended on VE Day. The combat record of the Tuskegee Airmen became one of the most powerful weapons in the burgeoning civil rights movement. How could America continue to justify a segregated military when these men had proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that skill, discipline, and courage had no color? Their performance was a key factor that influenced President Harry S. Truman. In 1948, he signed Executive Order 9981, a monumental act that officially desegregated the United States Armed Forces. The wall of military segregation, which had stood for nearly 2 centuries, finally came crumbling down, and the red tails had provided the dynamite. The man who had been forged in the silence of West Point, Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., would go on to become the United States Air Force's first black general. Yet, national recognition was painfully slow to arrive. For decades, their story remained a niche piece of history, largely unknown to mainstream America. It wasn't until 2007, more than 60 years after they had last flown in combat, that President George W. Bush awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor, to the surviving Tuskegee Airmen. Only 300 of the original pilots were still alive to receive it, old men with straight backs and clear eyes, finally receiving the thanks of a grateful nation. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen isn't just in the history books or in the beautifully restored P-51 seconds that sit in museums. It lives in the powerful question they forced America to answer. What truly defines a great nation? Is it the color of its citizens' skin? Or the content of their character? They fought 3 wars. They defeated the fascism of the Luftwaffe in the skies. They challenged the prejudice of their own country through their undeniable excellence. And now, the 3rd war, the war against being forgotten, falls to us. This is where their story becomes our responsibility. Share this video, tell someone their story. But most importantly, in the comments below, we want to hear from you. Tell us about a quiet hero in your own life. A parent, a teacher, a friend, someone who fought for something bigger than themselves against overwhelming odds, because that is how we keep the spirit of the Red Tail Angels alive. By recognizing the courage that exists all around us, we honor the courage they showed above the clouds. Don't just watch history. Make sure it's never forgotten.